I've been shooting Fujifilm for 7 years now, and I've gone through a range of different cameras. I'm now on the X-T4. And in this video, I'm going to run through all the settings that I use for taking street photography, urban photography, and all sorts of documentary style images. We're currently in Thailand, and I've been producing a whole series of videos. They're coming up on the channel, and I hope you enjoy some of the images that will be seen in those future photography vlogs. But for now, let's run through the settings on this camera. So to start off with, I actually set the camera to RAW plus JPEG. Now I started throwing in JPEGs about a year and a bit ago when I started doing just Fuji JPEG only. You can see those videos up on the channel. So the reason I do RAW plus JPEG is because sometimes I want those images that are quick and ready to use to send to my smartphone, to put onto Instagram stories and other places. But mostly, I'm editing the raw images, and in Lightroom, I just hide the JPEGs. So I actually see it as a massive benefit to hold on to the JPEGs. They don't really take up that much storage space in the grand scheme of things, and if ever I need to really just whittle down my library, I've got those JPEGs ready and waiting, and I may need to offload the RAW somewhere else. So the JPEG film simulation recipe that I'm using is actually my Cozy Chrome 3. So I'll leave the settings on screen here. And the benefit of that is that I get to experience those through the viewfinder, so it's all nice and pleasant when I'm looking through. I've got the nice colors, I've got everything. But also it gives me a bit of a reference image when I look at them in Lightroom that I can compare side by side with. And yeah, it's just a great viewing experience. Most of my film simulation recipes are based off of Classic Chrome. I still love that, it's my favorite one. I know I went through a period where I really liked Classic Negative, but you know what, I came back to Classic Chrome, I still love it. Sometimes I do set the EVF to across or monochrome and view things in black and white. You get the benefit of seeing things by the light, and therefore you're composing your images based on the light that you're seeing rather than the color. It's an interesting way, sometimes it makes your images better. So my main shooting style when in urban settings is aperture priority. Now of course on a Fuji camera everything's based on dial, so you don't really have an aperture priority mode. So the way you actually set it is you set your shutter speed and your ISO both to auto, and then you just have your aperture control on the lens. Now I'm usually in the range of about f2 to f5.6. And quite often I'm using the 35mm f2 lens. That's kind of my go-to. I'm using it about 80% of the time in urban environments. And so aperture priority is literally just controlling with the ring on the lens, and you use some of the other auto settings and parameters to control your exposure and limit where your exposure is going to go. And so if you want to take over any of the other controls on the camera, you can then just set your shutter speed manually with the dial, or you can set your ISO. So you've got like this hybrid between aperture priority, shutter priority, full manual. You can take whichever bit you want and convert it into your own hybrid auto manual mode. That's one of the reasons that I love using Fujifilm. And so because I've got a few things being controlled automatically by the camera, my main sort of exposure view of things is all done with the exposure comp wheel on the side. So I'll quite often switch between plus and negative of maybe up to one stop of light difference, and then I'll compose my scene, and depending on the light that I'm faced with, I'll change my exposure comp to adjust the overall image. So the camera is mainly doing two things automatically for me: the shutter speed and the ISO. Those are all controlled with your auto ISO settings in the camera. You have 3 that you can set, and I've got them quick access with the up on the D-pad. So I set Auto 1 as my main one, and this does a few things. So it sets the base ISO level to be 160, and then I set an ISO limit of 3200, and then a minimum shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. I use this as my everyday out and about sort of street use. So on days like today, nice and bright, minimum shutter speed 1/200th means that I can freeze the frame of most moving subjects. That's people walking past, bikes and things like that. For my Auto 2, I have the same base ISO of 160 and max 3200, but the shutter speed as an auto. So if it is a bit darker and it needs to go slower than 1/200th, it will do that. So I'll use that in kind of like the twilight evening zone. And then Auto 3 is again minimum ISO of 160 if it can, but a limit of 12,800, and again the automatic shutter speed. Now this is great for nighttime because it will push that ISO as high as it needs to go pretty much for those dark scenes, and the shutter speed it will counteract and use as slow as it can go. This one I use sparingly because you are going to open up to more noise and more motion blur and things like that. So I use this one very much firmly handheld and only at nighttime. The other automatic feature that's happening within the camera is the auto white balance. Now I've tossed and turned between different auto white balance modes. You've got one that is for ambient priority, which means that if you've got like tungsten lights, it's still going to show like a yellowy sort of warm image. And you have one that has a white dominance, which means it's going to convert those into bright white and prioritize white in your scene. I still find that Fuji auto white balance isn't always the best. It kind of ends up being a bit more blue than I'd like a lot of the time. So recently I've actually found myself using a fixed white balance when I'm out and about. That's great when the weather's the same, you know, days on end, or even throughout the same day itself, and I can just set it to daylight or to cloudy if I want to bring in a little bit of warmth or shade or things like that. But when the scene is changing and you've got, you know, fast moving clouds and other weather systems happening, then I do usually go back to an auto white balance. Of course, shooting raw, you can change it in Lightroom afterwards, but for those JPEGs that are coming out of the camera, yeah, I usually leave it on a particular white balance. Autofocus on Fujifilm can be hit and miss. At times, it can be great, excellent. Other times it can be really frustrating and it hunts about and it goes for the wrong thing and other stuff. So when it comes to autofocus on the X-T4, I'm quite often using continuous mode with the switch at the front, but I've set a button on the back to be an AF lock button, and I just hold it with my thumbs. Once I've got my subject in focus, I hold that button and it locks the focus for me. When my focus is locked, I'm then able to reframe or do anything else, or even just move into a scene knowing that something's going to come into focus at that focal plane. So I use the AEL button on the back, which locks my exposure and my focus, and then I can reframe and I can move about and it doesn't change anything, and I can then happily take my shots. Or I use the AF on button as an AF lock button, and that way if I want to reframe and still have the exposure change for me, I can use that. So between those two buttons I've got the choice. As for setting the focus, I just use the focus lever, which is that little joystick on the back, and I just move it around. I've also got the camera set up to remember different focus positions depending on the orientation. So from horizontal to vertical, it will change that box's position. And I set the size to, I think it's on one of the medium sizes. And I make sure that I've got all of the points enabled so that we've got focus position edge to edge of the frame pretty much. There is the face tracking autofocus, but I actually don't use it very much. I find quite often it prioritizes faces within a scene, and if I'm out doing urban and street photography, sometimes you get a lot of faces and you're actually not wanting the face that it's chosen. And so I find just positioning the box far easier for getting greater results for my images. I do find actually that if I'm using a longer lens, such as my 50 to 140, I quite often prefer to use AF single shot, just because when you're at longer lengths, you've got greater chance that something will come in front of you without you realizing, and the focus may shift and adjust that way. On a similar note, with my shooting mode at the top, I chop and change between single shot and continuous low. With my continuous low, I think I've got it set to 5 frames a second, and single shot obviously will just take the one image. And that way, depending on the scene, if it's fast moving or anything like that, I can either get a burst of images or I can just go for single and just make sure I'm getting my images that I want. On the camera, you can set custom buttons for pretty much any of the buttons here. Quick access to do that is to just hold the display back button and it will open up the menu, and then you can go through, you can choose things you can set. So I've changed quite a few buttons on here, and there's a few very notable ones. Primarily, this one on the front here, I use that as an auto exposure lock. So I mentioned that I got auto focus locks on the back, and I've got an auto exposure lock here on the front. So that way I can frame something, I can find my exposure that I like, I can lock it, and then I can reframe, and I can get an image with the exposure that I wanted originally. On the top, this button here is a toggle for face detect on and off. This is helpful if I've got portraits that I want to take, or if I'm going to hand it to someone else to get a picture of me, I can just turn the face detect on, and then they can make sure that they get the image and I'm in frame and in focus. On the back, we have the D-pad, and it's a shame that some Fuji cameras are actually getting rid of this. But up, I have my ISO settings. Right is where I set my white balance. Down is where I set the performance of the camera, and I usually use it on performance mode with EVF resolution priority. And then the left button chooses my film simulation. Again, mostly it's on classic Chrome, but I've got quick access to change things here. The joystick, of course, is just for my focus position. You can of course use the screen for focus, but generally I'll use the lever. So I chop and change how I go about using the camera. And of course, most of the time I'm out filming, so I'm also holding a camera with a microphone and other things, which is usually on a strap. Sometimes I'll use a strap on the X-T4 and I'll have that around my neck, and that's just got quick and easy access, and then my video camera is also around my neck just over to the side. But recently I've gone back to using the Peak Design capture clip pretty much exclusively with no strap at all. That means that I can walk around comfortably and I can bring the camera down towards my side, which if I had a strap on, I wouldn't be able to bring it down that far. And I can kind of walk casually, inconspicuously, and I can bring the camera to take images when I want to. But also, when I want my hands available, I can just clip it in. Sometimes I'll do it with the strap and I'll just leave the strap around my neck and still clip it in. But this way I found, especially in the heat, like we are in Thailand, I found it to be a lot more comfortable just to have the one strapped camera, and then this way. If you're not making videos, likely doesn't really matter. But of course I'm making videos about photography, which makes it a hell of a lot more clumsy and awkward and very frustrating, but all the while worth it. Likewise, walking around with your camera up like this, I know it looks a little bit weird, but once you're immersed into a scene, just moving your wrist to take a photo like that is far less noticeable than bringing your camera all the way up to take an image. If you're trying to get an inconspicuous image, doing something like that, very easy to get, whereas moving big is very noticeable. So I've been putting to use all the settings that I use in my camera across all of my images that you can see on my Instagram. I post a lot to my Instagram stories, as well as to my posts, and on this channel here, plenty of videos coming up from this Thailand trip. Very excited to edit and share a lot of those. We've been here for quite a while, made a lot of stuff in Bangkok, and I think you guys are gonna really enjoy it. Likewise, if you want to support the channel further, you can check out the links in the description. I got links to my Lightroom presets, the animated titles that you've seen across this whole video, and a few other things. I don't really do many sponsorships on the channel, so any way that you can support is a massive help, even if it's just sharing this video with your friends across social media or posting it to Reddit or whatever. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the settings. I hope they're useful for you if you've got a similar camera or if you want to do your own thing. And I look forward to seeing you in a future video real soon. Thanks for watching. See you later. Bye bye.